Okay, forget everything about Elden Ring for a second, guy. Come on. What we need to do now is ask a very important question. Where did we come from? Where do we go? Where did we come from, Akatana Joe? And if you think the answer to that question is evolution by a process of natural selection, you would be completely wrong. Uh, well, at least partially. It's complicated. Today we're going to look at what it might mean to have been created by a creator. But is Miyazaki God? Or is he just a guy? And if you think the answer is that he's just a guy, um, okay, I don't, okay, well, I'm gonna be a little bit careful because just in case, I don't want to get smited or anything. Today, we turn back the clock 300 years before we ever had any idea of evolution, and once again ask the question, where did we come from? And this time we get a different answer. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna stop doing the Space Ice voice. Thank you, Space Ice. And now, a reading from the book of Genesis. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And that being's name was Adam. But this is not the only story where mankind was created in this way. It turns out that humans being created from clay is actually kind of a common story. Let's go back in time a little bit before the book of Genesis had any widespread relevance to a place that was maybe then called Sumer. This civilization existed in an area of the world that we today call Iraq, and it was considered one of the first civilizations by experts, roughly 5500 to 1800 BC. And these Sumerians also had a story where humankind was created by a higher power, making them out of clay. In their story, humankind was created to serve the gods, and this is another kind of recurring theme that we're going to see. Not too far away from the Sumerian civilization, we can travel to Egypt and see what they were up to. We find another version of the story where a god named Canute would place the clay baby inside of the mother's womb. And then 9 months later, we've got a new baby. Well, what about the Greeks? What are they up to? Here we find the myth of Prometheus, where mankind is once again molded with clay because Prometheus loved his creation so much he gave them the gift of fire, and because of this he got punished by Zeus. Apparently Zeus would have preferred that mankind never have fire, which is a symbol for knowledge, so apparently Zeus would have wanted us to stay in that cave for all time. To the east of Iraq, we find Iran, which was at the time Persian and under the religion of Zoroastrianism. And in this ancient belief system, we again find a story where humankind was fashioned out of clay by a creator. These stories are not limited to the cradle of Western civilization. We've got these stories all over the world, kind of similar. So there's several examples from Africa. We've got Hindu versions from India. China, Japan, and Korea all have versions of humanity being created from clay in some way. We even find examples of this all the way across the ocean. In the Inca mythology, several Native American tribes, as well as other examples. And so I'm going to speculate a little bit here. Just like telling stories seems to be a pretty common human activity no matter where we go in the world. I would say that coming up with a story is a way of creating an understanding of the world. These are rational, common sense narratives that we invent from what we have ready at hand. But another way that we could look at stories is that they serve no immediate practical purpose. In this sense, stories can be a form of entertainment. It's not only stories that we come up with that serve no immediate practical purpose. Outside of the realm of words, we do something kind of similar by creating objects that are meant to impress directly on our senses. And we call these things art. Stories and art serve many of the same purposes. There is the entertainment value, and there's also this idea of meaning creation sometimes. It depends how the work is interpreted, much the same as words. And again, in the same way, there is this disconnect between what the artist may have intended and how the interpreter interprets it. Of course, religious practice makes use of both words and art in their communication, making it entirely dependent on interpretation. And because of this, many religions have official interpretations. They don't want a common person to be able to interpret the words themselves for various reasons, we'll say. We might even say that this desire to create things is some kind of human universal. And when we do decide to create something, we'll do so with whatever material we have ready at hand. One of these materials that's been found all over the world apparently has been clay. And considering how much of our stories are just about us, it's also not too surprising that very often we'd be using clay to create little clay humans. And of course, we still enjoy creating stories, so why not create a story about making humans out of clay? If we can create humans out of clay ourselves, maybe there's some higher power creating us out of clay, right? A fairly intuitive, common sense explanation. The fact that we've got all these different similar stories may just be natural. Maybe there's some common thread in the human imagination that transcends language, cultural, and religious barriers. Some type of archetypal clayman in the collective unconscious. But now, if we step away from this story-based intuitive understanding of creation and look at a more scientific material perspective, every single atom of our material bodies is one that has come from the earth at some point. And there is this real continuous replacement of these atoms all through our living existence. Upon our deaths, all of these atoms simply return to the world. In a very real sense, we become dust again. And so this material cycle that was intuited by early religion is actually scientifically real in a sense. Metaphorically, we are shaped from the clay of the earth, and scientifically, we are composed of matter that comes from the earth. But now for this whole creation idea, there is something interesting here too. The origin of life is still an ongoing area of investigation. We don't have definite answers on this scientifically, but there is one idea related to clay. It turns out that clay minerals can act as a catalyst in the polymerization of amino acids into nucleotides, which, if you don't know what that means, that's kind of like creating proteins, which would then much, much later be created by DNA processes. So, at least in this theory, clay was involved in the origin of life, biochemically speaking. And again, if this is true, our intuitions would have turned out to have some reality behind them. Because interpretation gives so much freedom, we could just say that religion said it all along. And which religion had it correct? Well, kind of like all of them. So, admittedly, this may be an easy answer, but it is one born out of the same mysterious ways as the ambiguous interpretation of religion and art. Now let's see how all of this connects to our beautiful video game, Elden Ring. Deep underground, this game has its own version of the clayman that we have to fight against if we want to. Now, these aren't the most difficult enemies. They're actually fairly easy to deal with. You just run past them basically because they're incredibly slow. They don't have any armor and they only have one weapon that drops that we can pick up and use, the clayman's harpoon. But there is one spirit ash that we can get that gives us a little bit of a clue about where these guys came from. It turns out they are the remains of priests who once served the ancient dynasty seeking revelation. And we could say that in seeking revelation, these priests were seeking knowledge in a way. It's hinting at some kind of overlap between scientific and religious investigation. And considering these guys cast these bubble sorceries, if you know about sorceries in this game, you're going to know that the bubble sorceries require arcane stat to use. So we could also say that these priests using this arcane stat are using something that's kind of like a mixture between intelligence and faith. Similar to these old priests, there's a spiritual as well as an intellectual combination happening. And maybe the idea here is that religion could have started off as an early form of science. It was seeking explanations for natural events by inventing stories to explain them. What's underneath both of these seemingly different ways of understanding the world is the same desire to attain knowledge, to understand somehow. Now, let's turn our attention to the other part of this Clayman story, the idea that these were creations meant to serve some higher power. There's this idea that as servants, the Claymen were meant to be kept ignorant, which, as we just saw, is directly at odds with real human nature. And that could have some interesting outcomes, let's say. We've got another hint here towards this Gnostic story. Probably should have explained this earlier, but just in case you're unaware of what Gnostics are, when we refer to Gnostics, we're talking about a group of people or several groups of people who existed before the official Orthodox version of Christianity would be created by the Romans, which would then become the Roman Catholic Church. But for several hundred years before this happened and after the crucifixion of Jesus, there was all these alternate versions of the different stories. And of course, the Romans didn't want to have all these competing stories like floating around out there. They wanted to have just one version of the story so they could say that this was like the real version, right? And to serve this goal, they would find all these competing writings and destroy them. If anyone was caught trying to tell one of these alternate versions of the story, well, they'd probably be put to death for heresy because people took lore very seriously at this time in history. But these stories would be passed along and live on in secret. One way that this happened was they weren't able to actually destroy all of the writings. I mean, they probably got most of them, but, a few of them slipped by. And because of that failure, today we still have a record of early Christianity in these writings. And one of these alternate texts was the creation story of Genesis. So now let's compare the two different versions of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, because this story has a lot to say about mankind seeking knowledge and serving a higher power. In the official version, Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. They're in paradise, they're having a good time, and all they have to do to stay in the paradise is not eat the apple. That's what God tells them. So I guess God had put this knowledge apple in the garden and said, hey, don't eat that apple. There it is. Don't eat it though. And the apple's kind of like the red pill of knowledge. It's going to reveal the true reality if they decide to eat it. But they have free will, apparently, also that God gave them, and they have to choose to not eat the apple. But it's right there. Don't eat it though. Just take the blue pill, God was heavily implying, while at the exact same time offering the red pill. So it's a little confusing, like why God would set things up like this, but it does kind of explain free will and temptation. So that's, I think, the point here, if I was to do like a commoner's interpretation of this story. And so one day a snake shows up who apparently, I guess God didn't know about this snake, but whatever. The snake shows up and tricks them into eating the apple, of course. So they were not able to resist the temptation and their free will. They used it to do something bad. And as a consequence for their actions, which they freely chose to do, they were not tricked into this at all. It was their own fault, and they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and this was original sin. So today, all of our pain and suffering is a result of these two early humans who either couldn't follow directions or maybe they got tricked by a sneaky snake. Either way, our pain and suffering is our own fault. Okay, so that's the official story. I apologize if I didn't get it 100% correct. I'm not like a expert. So in the Gnostic version of Adam and Eve, it's quite a bit different in many ways. The first, most heretical thing that we have to talk about in the Gnostic version is the idea that the God that Adam and Eve are interacting with is not like the real, true, above all God. It's instead this lower God creation. This lower God has many names. I'm just going to call him the Demiurge, but there's other names as well. This Demiurge, flawed craftsman, was responsible for creating humanity out of clay in the very same way as the traditional story, but he didn't actually breathe life into the clayman. That was done by a different god. The Demiurge was created himself by a higher god called Sophia. Sophia took pity on the Demiurge and his creation because his little clay people were kind of dumb. Sophia decided to breathe into humanity the divine spark, which would make us divine. And this divinity that we were granted came from a power that was above the Demiurge. This would end up making the Demiurge jealous of humanity because now his little claymen creation have the capacity to become even more powerful than him, actually. Yeah, it turns out that us humans have the capacity to become the chosen one by attaining secret knowledge. And the Demiurge doesn't like this at all. He created these humans to worship him, of course, because he's got these deep-seated problems with self-worth that he doesn't deal with in a healthy way. And now this leads into the second big heresy that we have to discuss when we're talking about the Gnostics here. So we're kind of used to thinking about God as this benevolent, good guy up there in the sky looking out for us and, being a good guy and everything. But this demiurge guy, he's not so much a good guy like we've already kind of seen. He has this extreme constant need for external validation. He's either jealous of people or he's putting people down, so he's constantly doing this splitting defense, like just all the time. And he's supposed to be all powerful, so like why is he jealous of people? Why is he like so insecure about himself? It just doesn't make sense. He seems to also enjoy kind of messing with people and torturing them for his own amusement. That's not normally seen as good. And then eventually he gets so frustrated and has a big tantrum and tries to like genocide the whole human race because he was mad at them. And so we don't need to do like a full diagnosis here, but we could just say that he's got some of these cluster B traits that we see with certain personality disorders. But does having a bunch of cluster B traits make someone evil? I mean, maybe. We could look at cluster B people as evil, if you want to go in that direction. I don't, though. I think they're just flawed people with a lot of problems. And that's what I see here with this guy. He's just like us. I mean, he's not perfect, and he just had to kind of deal with his power and his problems. And just like some of us, he ends up not dealing with it in very constructive, good guy ways sometimes. But in no way does this understanding excuse what bad guys do. You don't want to get tricked by the naturalistic fallacy. Explanation for evil does in no way justify it. But to summarize this little heresy, okay, it turns out that God is kind of bad. And this is why currently we are all living in hell. Which makes some sense if you think about it sometimes. And also we get an explanation for the problem of evil. We're created by some evil god who wants to keep us stupid. And it's our own ignorance and stupidity that causes evil. Okay, well, we're not done with this secret heretical knowledge that I found on YouTube and Wikipedia just yet. We've got one more kind of big one here to talk about. The snake that tricks them into eating the apple. Well, this was not some kind of just normal snake or even the devil in some versions. This was actually Sophia herself, who again was the higher being who created the demiurge in the first place. And so this explains why the demiurge didn't know that the snake was there, because the snake is a higher power than him. Snake Sophia tells Adam and Eve to eat the apple because if they do this, they're going to figure out that they're just being tricked by the demiurge. Sophia and the unknowable God above all have different intentions for humanity than this demiurge or some of these other cluster B characters. They want humanity to escape the prison, and the way they escape the prison is by acquiring secret knowledge, and biting this apple is the first step towards that. Okay, so that's kind of a quick version of the Gnostic creation story with a few details left out. There was a point to all this, so we're going to get to that now. We compared two different versions of the same story, and now let's look at a contrasting idea. There seems to be a different answer for why humanity was created. On the one hand, it seems humanity was only created to serve the gods. On the other hand, it looks like humanity was created to guide its own destiny. And what we actually find is that there's no easy answer to this question. Just like the history of this Adam and Eve creation story, things are kind of complicated. Alright, well, this will connect back to Elden Ring now. We're going to get to that pretty soon. So we've already described we've got these claymen underground who are seeking knowledge, and they're doing so to serve the ancient dynasty. Like we just saw with the two different Adam and Eve stories, these claymen also have some ambiguous purpose. Now we need to introduce a twist to the story, because at this point I believe that the claymen are going to undergo a type of evolution. And just because I'm sure not everyone knows how this works, and it's going to be important later, I'm going to explain just really quickly how evolution works, okay? It's only going to take 1 minute. You start with one population in one area, and something is going to happen that's going to cause this one population to split into more than one population. The separate populations are going to be kept separate. There may be a great distance between them or some other factor that causes them to never come back together. Next, over a very long period of time, these separate groups are going to have random genetic mutations in their populations. When one of these mutations gives some kind of survival advantage to whatever this organism is, This mutation will more likely be passed down to further generations because the ones that don't have it will just die more likely. And then, after this has been happening for a very long time, millions of years, if you were to place those two original groups back together, they would be so genetically different that they could no longer bang each other and have kids. And this is the process that leads to all the diversity of life that we find in the world. Okay, there we go. Evolution, not too bad. Back to the story. Our claymen are under the ground. This is where they started from because we know under the ground this is like the past. So this is a long time ago. What would have happened though is like some of these claymen would have escaped to the surface somehow, or maybe they were taken by someone. Either way, they were split from these guys, and over a long period of time, they were changed. In this story, we don't have evolution exactly. We have something called the Crucible, which does something kind of similar. Like it basically mixes things together. So our claymen are going to undergo a kind of evolution now. The original population of claymen are the guys that we find underground, and from this point, they're going to branch out into other areas. Or again, it doesn't have to be all of them. Some of them can stay behind and not change, but some of them are going to move on to a different area. This original population, having moved out of underground, could have branched off into a few different directions, and I think we see that actually. So the first one that I find that I think is pretty similar to these claymen is the stone diggers, the miners that we find in the mines, in the caves. These guys are also like very slow, and they don't seem to be wearing any clothes, and they're interested in digging. They like to dig in the rocks, and this is maybe kind of good for people who want to get what's in those rocks, which is the Carian glintstones. So, of course, these guys have been taken away by the Carians and put to work. Maybe not by the now Carians, probably the old Carians who were the Onyx Lords. Okay, so here's the idea. The Onyx Lords take these claymen away from their home, and then they put them in a mine. Then over some period of time, they start getting like more rocks on them because again, Crucible is kind of mixing things together, so they're developing rocks on them because the rocks are conscious, right? But if you look on a description of one of the Stone Digger sorceries, it kind of like mocks these guys, saying that they're not that smart, like they're not scholars, I guess, which is a little bit rude, Carians. I mean, don't be so elitist. It's kind of disgusting. But anyway, so if there's another, I think there's another group here that we're looking at. If we've got this explanation, there's some other guys that are smarter, and they maybe they do wizardry a little bit better. And I think now we're looking at the origin of the Albinauric species, maybe. Now these guys are a lot more humanoid looking than the stone diggers, of course. They use normal magical spells like glintstone pebble when they're trying to kill us. For some reason, these guys have problems with their legs, like they're either falling off or they just don't work very good. Now, we don't know exactly what caused these guys to lose their legs, but it's probably something genetic. It's also possible that this gene was selected for. Sometimes a genetic advantage comes with some other disadvantage. Genetic changes that happen naturally over a long period of time we would call evolution. But this evolutionary force can also be created unnaturally and work much faster. We know that the Albinaurics were created by humans, and I think the way this was done was by shaping their evolution, kind of similar to how a dog breeder would shape some new breed of dog. As for this genetic mutation that caused them to lose their legs, if this was something that the breeder was selecting for, it could have been that this was some way to control them easier. Or more likely, there was some other gene that they were selecting for that was attached to their legs for some reason. What they were really selecting for, I think, was some ability to create portals. If you know about the Dune story, here I'm imagining something kind of similar to those Spacing Guild guys that are floating in the tanks. They had been mutated by the spice and selectively bred to have this ability to warp space-time and travel really quickly. Kind of similar to what we do when we click on a portal. One other thing possibly related to evolution is the fact that we find the male and female Albinaurics completely separated. So it's almost like someone has separated them so that they can't breed with each other, maybe. The only exception we get to this is Gaius. We don't know if Gaius and his wife had any babies, but it would really be interesting to know if they did. Or even if they could because of those evolution reasons. Because whoever's separating and manipulating these Albinaurics may have other intentions for them. There is one female Albinauric that wasn't separated. It seems like this is Latenna, and we find her in a cave. And if we decide to follow her quest line, we're led into the consecrated snowfields where we find the other female Albinaurics. We find this one really large Albinauric in this church, and Latenna, speaking to us in our ear somehow, tells us that we need to give her the birthing droplet. Whatever this birthing droplet is, it's meant to give new life to the Albinaurics. It's probably something like the silver tear material that we get to use. And this material itself, I believe, was at one point the blood of the Nox. When one of these Albinauric females creates new life, what I'm imagining happening here is she's actually creating one of those larval tears. The Carians were using these Albinaurics to farm larval tears for themselves. And this is, of course, a horrible way to treat people, but the Albinaurics are not really people. The Carians would not have extended their empathy to this outgroup, so this would have allowed them to exploit them much easier. We'll come back to this idea in a minute. So it's possible that this portal gene is something that the Nox had originally, and the Carians are just kind of exploiting it now by recreating it with these Albinaurics. And that they also farm the females for larval tears. So to the Carians, these Albinaurics really do seem to be kind of like livestock. This means that the Albinaurics are related to the Nox in a way, but this artificial Nox way of life has other forms as well. We see a bit of a odd family reunion taking place in Ordina, liturgical town. There are these female Albinaurics who were created by combining the clayman with the Nox blood. And we've also got these Newman mimicking Black Knife assassins created from a mimic tier, which was a technology created by the Nox. So it would certainly appear that our Albinaurics are quite a bit different from our Stone Diggers or from our Claymen, but is that really true? One very important lesson to learn when playing this evolution explanation for everything game is that sometimes appearances can be deceiving. What you see on the outside doesn't matter as much as what's on the inside when it comes to genetics and love. And because of how wildly complicated genetics are, you can have very different genetics and similar appearances, or you could have very different appearances and very similar genetics. We can't always rely on appearances to understand what things are similar and different from one another. But in the early days of evolutionary thinking, there was a lot of Dunning-Kruger biologists out there who were trying to use evolution to explain everything. One example of this fallacious thinking was applied to human populations. Because evolution has this baked-in idea of survival of the fittest, some of these guys thought that evolution meant that different races meant that there were superior and inferior races. These guys didn't understand fitness or genetics, and they were just making their assumptions based on appearances. Today we would just recognize these guys as being racist, a type of in-group bias, but now we could actually use evolutionary psychology to find out why they were being racist. A man being a wolf to another man could also be interpreted as tribalism. Basically, if anyone looks like you and your family, they're safe, and if they look different, they could be dangerous. This is sometimes referred to as fast thinking. Making quick decisions would have some kind of survival advantage in some cases. In this way, evolution explains the origin of racism. But we should be able to see the flaw in this thinking. Just because someone looks different from you does not mean automatically that they're some kind of threat. But we still have those old caveman brains in operation, and these caveman brains often get triggered when people make us scared. This is yet another example of something that comes natural, not always being a good thing. With genetics, what is sometimes an advantage in some situations is a disadvantage in other situations. Thinking fast or using common sense can sometimes be just completely wrong. But now back to this idea of the Carians not extending their empathy out to the Albinaurics. In this case, these Albinaurics really were a separate species from the Carians, so we might see why this extension of empathy wasn't really warranted. People don't always empathize with non-human animals, but of course the fact that these Albinaurics look like humans is telling us something. Humans also don't always empathize with other humans. Because our caveman brains get scared, we fall back on these primitive thinking styles. And when we do this, it's showing a lack of empathy, not some problem with empathy itself. Don't get tricked by that one. Dehumanization of others based on some flawed concept of race is not only ignorant, but it's got us into some pretty dark places in history. But just like we see with how these Carians treat the Albinaurics, it's a lot easier to treat someone badly when you don't see that person as an equal human being. But back to evolution, it is true that the same evolutionary forces led to the apparent differences among human races. Importantly, this was just an appearance because what would have been necessary for a true evolution or speciation never happened. Human populations would have had to stay completely separated for a very long time, and that never happened. Different groups of humans have always intermingled. And on top of that, our common ancestor wasn't that long ago, relatively speaking. So, despite appearances, there really is just one human race from the perspective of genetics and maybe from the perspective of clayman stories. Okay, finally, we need to close this loop and go back where we started by talking about the second generation Albinaurics. These guys we find at Liurnia of the Lakes kind of having a little party in the water. So it's possible that their mutation into these frog guys was something to do with that. I'm not totally sure, to be honest. However it happened, they get their legs back and they get some acrobatic skills somehow. But if this mutation happened on purpose, like the other ones may have, I think the person doing it this time was probably Marika. Marika would have recruited or maybe created these guys on purpose to help her fight a war against the Carians. Marika would have told these Albinaurics that they had been exploited for a very long time by the Carians, which was actually true. But by tapping into that resentment, Marika had opened Pandora's box. Because of their fantasy defenses, people like Marika may become delusional and make wild, irrational decisions. They believe themselves to be above all consequences and push things way too far. And when this happens, they end up destroying everyone, including themselves. But before things get to that point, there's usually some kind of a backlash. When people are being oppressed and they can't take it anymore, they may rise up against their oppressor and have a revolution. And it was exactly this instinct that Marika initially exploited to her own advantage. But Marika's war against the Carians would eventually fail, and with this, the revolution of the Albinaurics would also fail. And what are they going to do after that? Just hang out in the water all day doing cartwheels? Come on, these are revolutionary frog boys. Now a guy named Vare shows up and he says he's got a plan for these Albinaurics. Instead of blaming the Carians, Vare wants to blame Marika and the Golden Order. The past would repeat itself and Vare would take this population and bring it back underground where they started from to Mog's palace. By telling them a very oversimplified and generalized story, Vare would be able to now manipulate these guys into doing what he wants, which was a bloody terror revolution against Marika, because this is just common sense to a guy like Vare. He has his own cluster B pathologies, and in his case, this manifests as being a kind of psycho killer cannibal type of guy. And to a guy like Vare, a bloody revolution is just common sense. All that matters is getting what he wants, and what he wants is blood. But who knows, maybe these spiky frog boys could have had their revolution if we hadn't stopped them. Because we have to kill Mog to get to the DLC, and he was their leader, so this would apparently be the end of the Albinauric story. Because whether they were created by the hand of some creator or some process of evolution, it didn't make a difference in the end. Their only role was in the service of others, and because they were not fully human, they would never realize this. Instead, they would repeatedly get tricked with easy answers and empty promises from people who only pretended to care about them, like Marika or Vare, the demiurge or the snake, depending on your preferred version. What they needed to learn but never did was that appearances can be deceiving, and most of the time, complicated problems don't have common sense, easy solutions, even though we might wish they did. Don't forget to like and subscribe, comment, and share. Whatever you want to do, that would be great. And if you made it this far, thanks so much for being here, and have a good one. Bye.